Yeah, I actually want to talk about conflict in Africa because when you look across Africa, you see the issue of terrorism that is ravaging the continent. You see civil war like what is happening in Ethiopia, the Tigray region. You see what is happening in Democratic Republic of Congo, that we have over 25 rebel groups in the country, the unrest in Burundi, and what we have all faced in Somalia. So you see conflict, even us in Nigeria, conflict, internal conflict all over Africa. Now, what are the factors responsible for this conflict? We have carefully studied that there are two main factors responsible for the conflict you see in Africa. One is the external factor, and the second one is internal factor. The external factor has to do with the West, foreign influence, so much on Africa. Of course, we all know that the world needs Africa much more than Africa needs the world. It's just that because the West control the mass media or the world media, so they always portray as if that Africa are only the ones that need the help from the West. They give it, they flash it on the light of the camera, but the truth is that the West cannot survive without Africa. So the West so much need Africa. So the West are very good in carrying and proxy system, what I call their divide and rule system. So most of the war you see in Africa, or the conflict or crisis in Africa, is most of them are instigated by the West, so that they can easily come, just like what is happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. They can easily come in and steal solid minerals and other rich resources, while these countries or these zones are in conflict, either on little pay or without pay. So foreign influence, what we call external forces, also part of the conflict in Africa. But I actually want to base my discussion today on the internal factor of conflict in Africa. Of course, you all know the internal factor just has to do with state actors, African sons and elite, Africans themselves. State actors in Africa are 80% responsible for the conflict we all see in Africa. For we all know that what happened in Berlin Conference 1884 to 1885, how they balkanized and scrambled African territories, the Europeans. They brought in different ethnic nationalities without consensus among them. So even after independence, you see almost all African states are just made up of different ethnic groups. And after independence, these ethnic groups were scrambling for power. Who will grab power? And state actors use this opportunity because of one ethnic group will be more either larger than the other. So they grab for power by ethnic nationalities, what I call ethnic champions, trigger conflict in Africa, because you see, most especially those from the larger part of the ethnic group, they grab power, and at the end, they marginalize or try to carry out discriminatory action, either politically, economically, socially, on a minority group. And the only way for this minority group to actually air their grievances or to air their voice was for them to become hostile. So this has been the sources of conflict or crisis in Africa. And another thing that is actually responsible, as it tied them down to state actors, is poverty in Africa. The few minority elite in Africa intentionally create poverty. And because young part of African populace are in poverty, so and the people have no other means to express to the government than to be hostile to the state. And this causes conflict in Africa. And another sources, or why we have also tied them down to state actors, why we have conflict in Africa, is religion. I tell people that after independence, those we call nationalists, then we are not true nationalists. They were those I call, they were either ethnic champions or religious fanatics. So religion itself, for example, terrorism in Africa is based on religion. You can see the Al-Shabaab, the Al-Qaeda group in Africa. You see, like the terrorism in Mali, in Burkina Faso, that is been affecting Benin Republic, the Boko Haram we have in Nigeria, and the Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and that affecting Somalia and Kenya and other parts of Africa. They are all tied to religion. So Africa produces ethnic ethnic champions, and the next thing we produce that has caused conflict in Africa is religious fanatics. I tell people that one of the worst things that happened to humanity was the introduction of religion, but I don't want to talk about that today. So, because we have produced these two sets of people, ethnic champions and religious fanatic, that has been the basis of conflict in Africa. So I'll tell people, if we really want all this conflict in Africa, to die away, I tell people that African state must begin to produce not ethnic champions again, not religious fanatic, but nationalists. It's not when we begin to produce leaders who are nationalists in nature, who don't attribute their